Hi everyone. One of my students asked me to specifically put together a short video on subject-verb agreement, something that we so often get wrong, particularly second language speakers. And just to open it up, very commonly used, there's football matches this afternoon. Now this is completely incorrect. Do you know why? Before we dive into the slightly deeper implications of subject-verb agreement, I'm just going to touch on three things because I'm going to be using a bit of terminology as we go along. First thing is the subject and how to find it. I'm also going to talk a little bit about countable and uncountable nouns, and just touch on the basics of conjugations, because these are all things we need to consider with our subject-verb agreements. For those of you who like the rules first, here it is. The rule basically is that the subject-verb agreement means that the subject and the verb in your sentence must agree in number. And that basically means they both need to be singular or they both need to be plural. So just before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, have a look at that sentence that I threw at you a moment ago. There's football matches this afternoon. Very commonly said, but consider your verb is. Football matches. Would you say there is football matches, or would you say there are football matches? Would you say there is apples, or there are apples? It's basically that simple, as I say, with a few nitty-gritty finer details in between. So let's have a look. So first things first, let's start with the basics. Do you know how to find a subject? Now, at primary school level, I know we were always taught to find the subject, you ask who or what is performing the action. This is not quite enough, and sometimes this throws us off course. I mean, look at us. You know, if you've got a sentence like, John kicked the dog, okay, who or what performed the action, who or what kicked the dog? It was John, so John is the subject. Easy. But what about a sentence like this one? Well, as a general rule, to find our subject, we find the verb first, and the only verb there is in that sentence. So we ask who or what is a beautiful country, I suppose, is Italy. It's not performing an action. But let's redefine our definition of how to find the subject. We ask ourselves, what is or who is the person, place, thing, or idea that is doing or being something? If you remember that, you should be able to find your subject every single time. In understanding countable and uncountable nouns, I want you to think back to the first time you ever learned to count as a child. Now, most kids, I imagine, would learn to count on their fingers. 1 finger, 2 fingers, 3 fingers, 4 fingers. Now, imagine if somebody had turned around to you at that age and said, hey, Johnny, count that milk. If you could ask the question, would you like 1 of something, or would you like 10 of something, and that makes sense, generally you're dealing with a countable noun. Would you like an apple? Would you like 10 apples? Would you like to write an assignment or 10 assignments? I'm sure you'd love that. Would you like a chicken or 10 chickens? Any of those examples over there function as countable nouns. In the case of uncountable nouns, these are the things like water or indeed any liquids, milk. You cannot say, would you like 1 water? Would you like 1 milk? Would you like a bread? Would you like 1 pasta or 10 happiness? None of these things can be counted, and therefore we call them uncountable nouns. In most of the cases on the right, the first thing that you'll notice is that we don't really have plurals for most of those words. We don't talk about waters, milks, rices, or happinesses, and there's your first indication that that is an uncountable noun. Let me draw attention to one thing I threw in there that I thought you might notice, was the example of the chicken. Now, I said with countable nouns we can ask the question, would you like 1 or would you like 10? Yes, would you like 1 chicken or would you like 10 chickens? Now we're talking about complete chickens. Be they alive or be they dead. I'm talking about whole chickens in this case. On the right, the uncountable noun example was, would you like some chicken? Now when we use chicken, we're talking about pieces of chicken. In other words, we're talking about not the complete animal. My apologies to the vegetarians out there. But if I say, would you like some chicken, I'm generally talking about, lunchtime. So, yes, our lovely language of English is full of exceptions. Chicken, lamb, fish, depending on the sentence, could be treated as a countable noun, or it could be uncountable. Okay, so before we move on, just a quick message on conjugations. Now, what I'm throwing up on the screen right now should look familiar to you. Second language speakers, if you happen to be a first language French speaker, conjugations are something in French that are even more difficult than in English. If you happen to speak Chinese or you know a little bit of Afrikaans, it's very easy because there are very few conjugations. For my South African friends, just as an example, ek is, hy is, ons is, julle is. It's the equivalent in English of saying I am, he am, you am, they am, which we know is incorrect. But we must be aware of these conjugations and consciously think about them when it comes to verb-subject agreement. The two that we're going to look at in particular are it and they, mainly because we'll start by looking at objects and we'll consider various objects or various single items as well as groups of items as well, and this will help you in your understanding of subject-verb agreement. There's no trick to the above two sentences. They're both correct. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that if you're a first language speaker, that we say the kettle boils, and we say the kettles boil. There's an S missing on the second one. But do you know the reason why? Well, let's recap that. If we go back to our pronouns, every subject can stand for one of those pronouns. I, you, we, he, she, it, or they. In this case, the first sentence, the kettle, is it. And in the case of it, or he or she, we use an S at the end of the verb, or an ES in some cases. So the kettle boils. In the second one, the kettles, we're now looking at using the pronoun they. We could replace the kettles with the word they, and therefore we use they boil, so we would write the kettles boil. That's your first rule of subject-verb agreement. And that's the real basics, just to kick off with. I'm going to leave these examples up for about 5 seconds or so. Rather just pause it and take some time to go through these examples and see, do you recognize which is the correct option in each case? Give it a try. While tackling that, I hope you recognized how important it was to identify the subject. Just to go through that, the subjects were the bread, the milk, his guilt, the terrain, the salad dressing, the pasta, not the country, and the water. You may have realized all these subjects came from our list of uncountable nouns. So if you consider that they cannot be counted, then we always consider them as single objects. The bread could be replaced with it. The milk could be replaced with it. Let's just look at those sentences. Where is it? It's on the table. It is evident. The terrain is very flat, or it is very flat. It tastes salty. From which country does it originate, and where has it flowed? So the rule there, always in the case of uncountable nouns, just treat it as a singular and consider that your pronoun you could replace would be it, not they. Wow. Well, sometimes the introductions take the longest. I was hoping to get through a lot more in under 10 minutes. But if you've got the gist of it so far, if you remember that we've got to consider countable and non-countable nouns, we've got to be able to find the subject, and we've got to recognize that conjugations play a large part in subject-verb agreement, then you've got the gist of what's going on. So I'm going to put together a second part of this, and we're going to go into the real details in that one. For now, take care. Cheers.